As you can probably tell by now, we are diving deeper and deeper into React. And in this module, we're going to have a look at another core concept which you will use in a lot of React apps you're going to build. And that will be custom hooks and how you can build your own custom hooks. Now, up to this point in this course, we already worked a lot with hooks, with the built-in React hooks React offers to us, like use state, use reducer, use effect, use context, and so on. So all these special React functions that start with use. You might remember that when I talked about the rules of hooks, I mentioned that you can only use React hooks in React component functions and in custom hooks. And I told you that those would be covered later. Well, now is later. Now we're going to explore how you can build your own hooks, why you might want to do that, how exactly you do that, of course, and we're going to do that at a concrete example or multiple examples. And we're also going to learn about the rules and practices and best practices that apply when you build your own custom hooks. So, what are custom hooks? And we need to clarify what they are before I can dive into the why. So, what are custom hooks? Custom hooks are in the end just regular functions, just as the built-in hooks like use state are in the end just functions, but they are functions which can contain stateful logic. You can build custom hooks, these custom hook functions, to outsource stateful logic into reusable functions. Unlike regular functions, custom hooks can use other React hooks, including other custom hooks, and they can therefore also leverage React state managed with use state or use reducer. They can access use effect and so on. With custom hooks, you can outsource logic, which you might be using in different components, into a custom hook, which you can then call from all these various components. So it is simply a mechanism of reusing logic, just as regular functions are, with the special thing that in these custom hook functions, you can use React hooks and other hooks. And that might, of course, still be a bit abstract. So therefore, let me give you a concrete example which shows you why you might want to explore custom hooks and how you then build a custom hook step by step and how you use it. Here is an example application. Of course, you find it attached. And as you see, this application has, in the end, just two counters. One counter counting upwards, one counter counting backwards. And of course, that's not a fancy application. We're going to see another example later in this module, but this application allows me to explore custom hooks together with you, show you why we might want to build custom hooks and how we build custom hooks. So here's the code for this application, which again you find attached. And in here, we in the end just got three components: the backward counter and the forward counter, the card component, which is just a wrapper component providing some styling, and in app.js, I'm using the forward and the backward counter components, and these components do just what their name implies. The forward counter uses use state and use effect to manage a state, and to create an interval which simply starts counting up and which then sets a new counter state every second, every 1000 milliseconds. And in the backward counter, I'm doing the exact same thing, but here I'm subtracting from the counter. But other than that, it's the same logic. So therefore, it is fair to say that these two components are fairly similar. Now, of course, we might be able to create one component instead and then use props to configure it differently, but it would also be realistic that in real applications, you have different components which, to a certain extent, might do related tasks. And it is fair to say that we therefore definitely have some code duplication in the forward and the backward counter. If we leave that small detail of subtracting or adding to the counter aside, it's exactly the same code in the end. And whenever you have code duplication in programming, you typically want to take that code and refactor it and create a function which holds the shared code. And that's exactly what we're going to do with custom hooks. Because the problem we face here is that the code which we want to reuse uses React hooks like useState and useEffect, and it updates the state by calling the state updating function. And as you learned with the rules of hooks, you are not allowed to use these React hooks in any random function. You must only use them in React component functions or custom hooks. So if we want to outsource that logic into a separate function, we need to build such a custom hook. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So how do we build a custom hook then? Well, typically, just as with components, we store every hook in a standalone file. So I will start by creating a new hooks folder side by side to the components folder. And in there, I will add the use-counter.js file. Now, the file name is totally up to you. You don't have to name it use-counter. I do name it like this though, because there is a clear rule which we have to follow when it comes to the function name inside of that file. Because we are going to create a function here, either as a const which stores a function or with the function keyword. I'll go for the const approach, but both would work. And that function which you do create has to start with use in its name. That is a must do. That is a hard rule which you have to follow. It will be a normal function in the end, but the use at the beginning signals to React that it will be a custom hook, and it gives React the guarantee that you will use that function by respecting these rules of hooks, so that you will use this custom hook function just as you use the built-in hooks. And that is a guarantee React needs, because otherwise, if you start using React hooks in your custom hook, and you would use your custom hook in a forbidden place, you would implicitly also use the built-in hooks in a wrong place. And that's why we start with use here, because React can look out for that. And actually, this project setup will give you a warning if you have a function starting with use and you then start violating some of these rules of hooks. That's why this is a must do. Start with use in the function name. And thereafter, you can name it however you want. I will name it use-counter and then store a regular function in it. And because of that function name, I also named the file like this. But again, for the file name, there is no specific rule. You could name it however you want. Now, of course, ultimately, the goal is to use this function in another file. So therefore, I will export this function here. And then inside of this function, we can start adding that logic which we want to reuse. And in our case, if we start with the forward counter, in the end, we can just copy that code here. From the forward counter, that code where we use useState and useEffect, not the code where we return JSX, just the other code. Copy that and add it inside of that useCounter function. Now, since we are using useState and useEffect now, we need to import these things from React, because you always need to import what you use. So here we import useState and useEffect, like this. Now we got this logic in this custom hook function. But of course, in the end, we still want to utilize it in our forward counter and later also in the backward counter. How can we do that? Well, you are going to use a custom hook just as you use the built-in hooks. You are just calling it like a function because it is just a function. So therefore, we want to import useCounter here in the forward counter component. Import useCounter from going up one level, diving into the hooks folder, useCounter. And in the forward counter, we can then just call useCounter. Now that alone will not do everything we need to do, but it is a start. Now we are calling this custom hook function. So when this gets called, obviously all that code will execute. So that state will be registered and that effect will be fired. Now if you call a custom hook in one of your components and that component, for example, registers a state or an effect as we do it here, then this state and effect will be tied to the component in which you use your custom hook. So if I call useCounter in the forward counter component, the state created here in useCounter will be tied to this forward counter. If we use a custom hook in multiple components, every component will receive its own state. So just because we use a custom hook does not mean that we share state or effects across components. Instead, for every component, the custom hook is executed again, and every component instance then receives its own state. So it's just the logic which is shared, not the concrete state. So therefore, in this case, since I call useCounter in the forward counter, this state is set up for the forward counter, and this effect is set up and fired for the forward counter component. But of course now, inside of the forward counter, I need access to the counter state, which is managed by the custom hook, because I want to output it here. And how can we do that? How can we make that happen? Well, just as we do it with the built-in hooks. For useState, this built-in React hook, this also does something behind the scenes. And it also creates and manages state, and then it does one important thing. It returns an array, which we are destructuring here. Custom hooks are just functions, and therefore they can return things. So here in the case of useCounter, to make that counter state available in the components that do use this custom hook, we can simply return it. We can simply return counter. You can return whatever you want to return in your custom hooks. That could be an array, or an object, or a number, or in this case, implicitly a number, because counter will hold a number. So now I'm returning this counter state here. So this state, which is managed or which is set up by that custom hook, I'm returning it here. And therefore, in the forward counter component, where I call useCounter, I can of course use that returned value. And here I can set up my counter constant, set it equal to calling useCounter. Since useCounter returns the counter, I can store it in a constant of this component. And now we can get rid of all that old code in here and slim down this component like this. Get rid of the imports because we're not directly using useState or useEffect in this file anymore. And now we got this slim component. And if we now save that, you will see that if I reload here, this counter, this forward counter, still works as before, but now with a custom hook. And that is how we build custom hooks and why we do it. And when it comes to the how, the most important thing really is just the naming. You have to start with use. And then you can use stateful logic in there, you can use other React hooks in there, and that allows you to share this logic across components. And speaking of that, let's now make sure that we can use this custom hook also in the backward counter component.